Dear beloved Sangha, it's such a joy to have the opportunity to be together with everybody. I do hope everybody is well. Everybody is well nourished and well supported in the Sangha. We have an opportunity to begin our exploration of the Lotus Sutra text. And as we approach the text of the Lotus Sutra, it will, of course, be helpful to keep in mind the image of the lotus flower itself. This flower that has its roots deep in the mud and with such beauty and fragrance reaches for the sky. While at times reaching for the sky or touching the ultimate dimension might seem to be in opposition to putting down roots into the mud or grounding in the historical dimension, throughout the Lotus Sutra, we're reminded that the insight of the Buddhas is that the mud and this transcendent realm are interdependent. Throughout this text, we find this dynamic, a focus on different levels of reality that might at first seem to be unrelated or even sometimes contradictory, but in fact are both happening at the same time, or are different ways of viewing the same experience. This is, as we spoke about last time, reflected in the structure of the sutra itself. Chapters 1 to 14 of the Lotus Sutra are often called the trace teaching, in which we meet Shakyamuni Buddha as a human. Our perspective in this section of the sutra is the perspective of someone walking the path. In Plum Village, we'd call this the historical dimension. This is the everyday world, a world of this and that, me and you, up and down and night and day. The world in which there are pairs of opposites: suffering, happiness, enlightenment, ignorance, and so on. The last 14 chapters of the Lotus Sutra are called the origin or base teaching, in which the underlying reality is revealed. We meet the Buddha as an underlying truth, an underlying energy of all that is. We can consider this section of the sutra as the ultimate dimension, beyond pairs of opposites or any concepts. It's important to remember that the ultimate dimension is not somehow superior to or better than the historical dimension. This is a common mistake. In fact, the historical and the ultimate dimension are two aspects of the same reality. We need the historical dimension in order to do the laundry. A lot of spiritualities teach transcendence in the sense of rising above this everyday world, that somehow the circumstances of our life are to be left behind for some kind of utopian state. Buddhism teaches that the ultimate is found in the historical and is not found anywhere else. People often come to a practice center thinking that they can get away from these everyday things, and are often quite disappointed when they see that we do the same things that they do at home. Perhaps they think that we're walking on lotus flowers everywhere. Well, in fact, we are actually. This is our practice, to be able to walk in such a way that lotuses bloom with every step. To be able to sit in such a way that we're sitting on a lotus flower. To breathe in such a way that everything we're looking for, everything that we're practicing in order to become, is available for us right in that breath. Recently, I was visiting Nyaplu Stream Entering Monastery in Victoria. There was a poster on the wall that read, "Walk like a Buddha." When I saw that poster, that calligraphy, I realized that this sentence, "walk like a Buddha," is written from the historical dimension, since there's still a sense of separation from the Buddha. We're walking like a Buddha. The ultimate dimension approach towards the same truth and the teaching that we'll find in the Lotus Sutra is not to walk like the Buddha, not to sit like the Buddha, but to claim your rightful inheritance. Walk as a Buddha, sit as a Buddha, wash your car as a Buddha, right in the here and now. This is something that is possible right here and right now. This is the core teaching of the Lotus Sutra. Beloved community, now we begin our exploration of the sutra text itself. So much has been written and taught about the Lotus Sutra. Personally, I feel that the transformative power of the sutra is revealed when we allow ourselves to have an encounter with the text itself. The word sutra in Sanskrit or sutta in Pali is what we call a teaching from the Buddha. It means thread, and it's related to the medical term to suture, to bind together. As we move through the Lotus Sutra, there are some themes, some different threads that weave their way through the text. And at the same time, it might be helpful to consider each chapter of the Lotus Sutra as being a separate but related sutra, bound together by a common thread, a common theme, or a series of common threads or common themes. In fact, in some cases, there are some chapters of the Lotus Sutra that are treated almost as separate sutras. For example, the Universal Door chapter, the Avalokitesvara chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is often chanted by itself as a separate sutra. It's contained also in the Plum Village Chanting and Recitation booklet, Chanting from the Heart. The Lotus Sutra begins with a very familiar phrase that almost all Buddhist sutras begin with, "Thus have I heard." As I mentioned in last month's talk, the Buddha was an itinerant wanderer, and very few people, including monastics, had heard many talks. After the Buddha passed away, then a gathering of 500 elders was convened on Vulture Peak in order to come to an agreement about the talks that the Buddha offered, as well as the monastic precepts. During that gathering, Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, who had what we'd probably regard today as an eidetic, a photographic memory, recited the teachings of the Buddha from memory for the whole assembly. And after that recitation, different sections of the canon were given to different senior students of the Buddha and their disciples to recite and to memorize and transmit to their students. Whenever I read a sutra, I personally find it very helpful to pause at that phrase, "Thus have I heard." When we read a sutra, we're hearing what Ananda heard. Actually, we're not sure what everybody else heard. We each hear what's needed by us, and sometimes that can be different from another person. I often find it interesting to sit in Dharma sharing groups after I've given a talk myself and to hear what people share having related to or having heard or having been struck by in the talk. Many times there are phrases reported that are not exactly what I said, or surprising parts of the talk that I did not think were the main point, but which people responded to deeply. So when I read a text and I encounter that phrase, "Thus have I heard," I reflect on the fact that if, as we'll hear, that there were many people gathered, then people probably heard and responded to many different individual things. I wonder what some of the other sutras would be like if we heard them from the perspective of other attendees. In some cases, they might even be quite different. So this line is a reminder to me to ask myself each time I encounter a text, what am I hearing in this moment as I sit with this sutra? Each time I encounter a sutra, I notice that with this attitude, this mindset, I hear something differently. I discover something that I hadn't noticed before. A part of me responds in a new way to the text. And this is something that definitely occurs with the Lotus Sutra. Each time we encounter the text, we discover something new. So each time you sit with a text, ask yourself, what am I hearing today? Many sutras have a typical formulation. They begin with, thus have I heard, evang me suttam, or in Sanskrit, evang maya srutam. And then they share the location that the talk was offered. The Buddha offered talks throughout his teaching career in many different key locations: the Jeta Grove, Shravasti, Deer Park, the Gabled Hall, and so on. One of the key places that he offered teachings, and many key and important teachings, was Vulture Peak, which is near the town of Rajagriha. Vulture Peak is given that name because from some perspectives, the shape of the mountain can seem like a vulture's head. So many key teachings were offered there, the Heart Sutra and so on. And of course, the Lotus Sutra. When you travel to Vulture Peak, you can see the place where the Buddha preached. You can see the foundations of his hut, the caves where Shariputra and others practiced. You can walk the pathway that the Buddha used to walk for alms round, and you can see where the gathering of elders occurred after the Buddha's passing away to recite the teachings. It's a powerful and evocative place. Tay always loved Vulture Peak. Every time we went there, Tay would perform a ceremony of reordination. We monastics would be retransmitted the precepts and we would shave our heads. Sometimes we didn't have a whole lot of water available, so we'd just shave one stripe on our heads in the ordination ceremonies, with the intention of shaving off the rest of our hair when we returned down the mountain at the end of the day to go back to our accommodation. So you'd see monastics walking around with one shaved stripe on their heads. If ever you travel to India, I hope you'll take the time to visit Vulture Peak. It's especially lovely in the sunrise and sunset to sit there and enjoy sitting meditation as the sun is coming up or going down. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell, coming back to our bodies, coming back to our breathing. The next key element in a sutra is sharing with us who was there, the audience for the talk. Who exactly were the hearers? This term hearers or shravakas is an important term that we'll encounter over and over again in the Lotus. We'll come back and explore this term in a little more depth later on in this series of teachings. Anyway, in the sutras, we hear who was there. We don't always know why they were there. I usually like to think about this since there can be a temptation to think that everyone who was there for a teaching of the Buddha was some kind of enlightened being. You know, if you study the texts, you'll discover that just like today, everybody had their motivations. Some people were practitioners. Some people came because they presumably had nothing else to do that day, or they came out of curiosity. Some people came to pick faults or to dispute the Buddha's teaching, to try to catch him out with some certain teachings to prove that he was wrong. Not everyone who was present for a talk of the Buddha enjoyed or benefited from the talk. Some even walked out. So this is a good reminder for me when people get bored with my talks. Sometimes, to be honest, nobody shows up for a class or for a talk or for Sangha, even though we've put in a lot of effort to prepare. In those moments, if nobody shows up, there's a temptation to cancel it. One of the greatest pieces of advice I ever received was to just carry on regardless. If people are there, we offer the Sangha session. If people are not there, we offer the Sangha session. If people are there, we offer the talk. If nobody's there, we also offer the talk as if they're there. This kind of sincerity builds up a kind of energy. If there's only one person, we offer the teaching as if there's 100. Also, if no one shows up, just give the talk, offer the class, facilitate the Sangha session as if there's 100 people there. Give the class, give the talk, lead the Sangha with the intention of infusing the air with the Dhamma so that everyone who breathes it will be affected in some way. If you can give a talk, if you can offer a class or facilitate Sangha to an empty hall, an empty room, with the same intention as to a full one, then nothing's going to shake you. I have a daily practice of offering incense outside the door here at Mountain Spring. The brothers laugh at me sometimes. For me, I do this practice not in a ritualistic way, but I light the incense and I have the wish that everyone who comes into contact with a molecule of this incense experience a moment of peace, a moment of freedom. Mountain Spring has no signs at the moment. You can drive by and miss it entirely. To be honest, just between us, I'm actually quite tempted to never put up a sign, even after we've built our meditation hall, dining hall, dormitories, and so on. Anyway, a few weeks ago, suddenly a group of people arrived here at Mountain Spring. It was really unexpected. They told us that they'd been looking everywhere for the monastery but couldn't find it. So they parked the car on a side street and began walking around, and suddenly the faint smell of incense came to them. They followed the smell of the incense and then found us. So when we have sincerity, then it's always useful. There's always a response. If you go to Vulture Peak, as I really hope you will one day, you'll notice that the physical location is not that expansive. It's not the biggest location in the world. Perhaps a few hundred people can fit up there at most. When we begin reading or hearing the Lotus Sutra, the introductory chapter begins with that phrase, "Thus have I heard," and then lets us know where we were and who was there. At one time, the Buddha was residing at Rajagriha on Vulture Peak, along with 12,000 senior monastics. And then 21 of these senior disciples are mentioned by names, and they're very familiar names. Up to this moment, the Lotus Sutra has been following the established form, and we can find ourselves settling in and feeling relatively comfortable. With the exception of hearing that there were 12,000 senior monastics present. This is our first hint of what's to come. Something extraordinary is occurring. If you've been to Vulture Peak, And many of the hearers of the Lotus Sutra would have been quite familiar with the Vulture Peak. And hearing that there were 12,000 people on Vulture Peak would have been quite surprising to them. So this is our first hint that something extraordinary is occurring. And in the next section of the introductory chapter, we discover that in addition to the 12,000 senior monastics, senior disciples, there are 2,000 others present, along with many thousands of their followers. Additionally, we hear that there are 80,000 bodhisattvas in attendance, along with various categories of beings, according to Buddhist cosmology, ending with King Ajatashatru, and they all pay respect to the Buddha. 18 of these bodhisattvas are mentioned by name, and their names are extraordinarily beautiful. Some of the bodhisattvas will be familiar to us, such as Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, and so on. However, others are new to us. It's so tempting to take a meandering side road here and to discuss a little about Buddhist cosmology and the different categories of beings that are mentioned in this text. I'm very tempted. Each of these beings has very beautiful characteristics. The Garudas, the Kinnaras, the Gandharvas, who live on the fragrance of incense and so on. The four great kings and their vows to support and protect the Buddha Dhamma. Each of these categories of beings has a whole backstory. And it can be quite inspiring. It's also quite interesting to understand some of the Buddhist cosmology. For me, when I read this section of the text, and I read about all of these beings, apart from the fact that we have a sense of Vulture Peak being the place to be, and every single category of being is there to receive this teaching, which will also, we will track back to as we move through the Lotus Sutra and we discover how the Lotus Sutra views itself as an underlying truth. We also, with each of these categories of beings, and the fact that they're all mentioned, we have this sense that the authors of the Lotus Sutra were deeply versed in so many aspects of Buddhism. And so in all of these different presentations, they're offering to us a very expansive view of Buddhism, the Buddhist teaching, and also the reach of the Lotus Sutra. For me, this is really one of the main points when we read this cosmology. Some people might be tempted to dismiss it out of hand, to think, well, this is kind of ridiculous. Other people might be really inspired, particularly those that enjoy more mystical teachings. But for me, as I go through these categories of beings, and we also understand that these categories of beings are not only beings that are outside of ourselves, but also different aspects of our own experience. We understand that the teaching is for every single being to receive with the capacities that they have, and that also the authors were deeply versed in Buddhism, and in a lot of ways, in order to grasp the brilliance of the Lotus Sutra and its radical and stunning reframing of the Buddhist teachings, it's helpful to have a grounding in these things. For now, please know that this series of talks is like being able to share only a drop of water from the Pacific Ocean with everyone. There's so much there. We can spend the rest of our life delving into the depths of this sutra. So basically, we can sum up this section by saying that basically Vulture Peak was the place to be and the place to be seen. The other thing that I think might be helpful as we move forward, particularly into some of the later chapters, is to understand what we call the three vehicles. There are a lot of ways to approach this teaching, But in the context of the Lotus Sutra, we have the vehicle of the hearer, the Shravaka. This is the pathway of those who aspire towards arhatship. Arhatship is a kind of individual liberation, one of the traditional 4 fruits of the path. Stream entering, where one's body and mind have merged with the Dharma, the once returner, the non-returner, and the arhat. An arhat is someone who's seen to be liberated and are living their final life in this samsara realm. An arhat becomes awakened by hearing the Buddha's teaching, either in person or, like in our situation, from teachers or from the Buddhist sutras. The next pathway is that of the Pratyeka Buddha. In the traditional view of Buddhism, there are a few periods that the cosmos goes through. The first is when a Buddha appears in the world and offers the teaching. It's considered to be easier to understand and to practice and to enter deeply. And then after the Buddha has passed away, it's seen that slowly, due to various causes and conditions, the purity of the teaching can go into decline over millions of millennia. It becomes harder to touch the teachings or touch the core of the teachings. And then over time, there's just a semblance of the teachings remaining, just the form. And then the teachings will be forgotten, completely forgotten and unavailable until another Buddha arises in the world, which is considered to be a rare and beautiful thing. The next Buddha, who will meet in the Lotus Sutra in a few moments, is Maitreya Bodhisattva, who's said to be waiting for the right moment to appear in this world. And up until now, in source Buddhism, there was a view that only one Buddha can be present in the entire cosmos, in the entire world system at a time. So we'll see as we progress through the Lotus Sutra, even in this introductory chapter, that this view of a Buddha being a very rare and a rare occurrence is completely blown out of the water. Anyway, a Pratyeka Buddha is someone who awakens by themselves during a time when the Buddha's teaching is not available for us. They don't teach others. And then there's the path of the Bodhisattva. In Theravadan viewpoint, the term Bodhisattva refers to a being who's capable to become an arhat, but decides to become a Buddha in order to benefit everyone. A Buddha is seen as a very rare being, and it's also seen to be incredibly difficult to become a Buddha. Therefore, Bodhisattvas are also, in this view, exceedingly rare. Prince Siddhartha, before his awakening experience, was a Bodhisattva. In the Mahayana viewpoint, not only is the understanding of the Bodhisattva expanded dramatically, but so is the view of the Buddha and of Buddhas. As we move through this text, we'll encounter these terms, and the Lotus Sutra will offer us a radical reinterpretation of this 3 vehicles teaching. The introductory chapter continues by mentioning that these 80,000 bodhisattvas had paid respects to countless hundreds of thousands of Buddhas. As I mentioned a few moments ago, in the Theravadan viewpoint, a Buddha is an extremely rare being. There are only a few Buddhas of the past mentioned, such as Dipankara, Vishvabhu, Krakuchanda, Shikin, and so on. Here we're hearing something that would have blown the mind of the original hearers of this text, and it actually still blows our mind, or at least my mind, today. That these bodhisattvas have paid respects to limitless Buddhas. Already in these few lines, we have a sense that something extraordinary is being conveyed. On the one hand, in the opening lines, we have the familiar formulation, and at the same time, a radical new perspective Again, this juxtaposition of mud and lotus, of earth and sky. Then the text continues on to tell us that the Buddha offers a teaching called the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. However, in the core text of the Lotus Sutra, the content of that teaching, the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, is not explained. The title in Sanskrit of the teaching that the text tells us that the Buddha offered is called Mahanirdeša. This can also mean simply the great instruction. Between you and me, and without wanting to be too controversial, I like that sense a bit more. Kumarajiva, the translator, translated Mahanirdeša as the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. A text was composed and made available in the 5th century, which is claimed to be the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, but there's no Sanskrit original or reference to a Sanskrit original that's available. The Buddha offered the great instruction. The Lotus Sutra continues by sharing with us that after offering this teaching, the Buddha entered into the contemplation of the samadhi of innumerable meanings, or the great instruction. Sometimes this is called the abode or the dwelling place of innumerable meanings, or the great instruction. I find this to be a helpful way to approach this, particularly in terms of meditative concentration. It's a dwelling place. I love this. Our teacher Tay always reminded us that 1 hour of study should go together with 7 hours of putting whatever we learn into practice. A teaching, a sutra, is a framework, a lens which we can use to understand our situation and the situation of our world more deeply. Otherwise, it's not very useful at all. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. This deep meditation causes heavenly flowers, celestial flowers, to rain down from the sky, and everyone's filled with delight. A few weeks ago here in Mountain Spring, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom, and as we would walk around the monastery, whenever the wind would blow, tiny cherry blossoms would be carried on the breeze. So I could relate to this image in the Lotus Sutra very much. Then the sutra tells us that from the middle of his forehead, the Buddha begins to emit a radiance which illuminates everything in all directions. And we see all beings who are living right at this moment in all directions. And also surprisingly, we see that at this moment in time, in all of these worlds, in all of these realms, there are Buddhas who are teaching and helping people, helping beings to transform. This is really an earth-shattering revelation. Up until now, not only was a Buddha seen as extraordinarily rare, but in Buddhist cosmology, it was believed that only one Buddha, as I mentioned before, could be present in the whole, and here's a quite technical term, 3,000 great thousand-fold world system at one time. It was not possible for two Buddhas to be present at once. It was seen, since it was seen that the energy of a Buddha was so powerful that if two Buddhas were present in a world, in the 3,000 great thousand-fold world system at once, everything would fall apart. Here we see that in the eastern direction, the western direction, the southern direction, the northern direction, and so on, wherever we look, in whatever situation we discover by this radiance that's being emitted from the Buddha, that's illuminating the world systems all around in a way that reveals things we couldn't see before but have been happening all along. We see Buddha's teaching along with their disciples. Then as the sutra continues and everybody's having this experience of somehow all of these experiences being revealed, being illuminated, a question arises. Most of the time, the Buddha's teaching comes about, the sutras come about because somebody asked a question. In this sutra, the being to ask the question is Maitreya Bodhisattva. As we've mentioned before, Maitreya is considered to be someone of very high attainment, about to become a Buddha. In fact, the very next Buddha in this world system. Here the question is being asked by a being of very high attainment. But as we mentioned before, the Lotus Sutra often turns things upside down, turns our understanding on its head. It's a bit like a Las Vegas production of the Insight of the Heart Sutra. Maitreya turns to Manjushri, who in many ways would be considered to be his junior, kind of like the newcomer on the block, and asks him in very poetic language, "Do you happen to know what's going on? I've never seen anything like this before." Manjushri responds by saying that he has seen this happen before. In other words, Manjushri knows something that Maitreya doesn't. It also suggests that contrary to our expectations that Manjushri is the junior, in fact, Manjushri might have been cultivating the way for longer than Maitreya Buddha. Manjushri then goes on to share a story of the distant past when another Buddha was teaching. Manjushri tells us that when, at that time, that same thing happened, and then the Buddha taught the Dharma Flower Sutra. We discover two things in this story. The first is that the Dharma Flower Sutra, rather than being a new teaching, is a teaching that's been offered before. In fact, as we'll discover, it's seen to be the underlying truth, the underlying reality, the ultimate reality of the whole universe. In some way, although each Buddha has their own emphasis, there's also a sense that each Buddha also brings forth the same truth. We also discover something, that those presently gathered have actually been together in various forms and roles from beginningless time, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. And it's a hint of what is to be revealed later on in the text. In fact, we are all of one nature. Many years ago in Plum Village, Tay, our teacher, shared with us that as practitioners, when we meet a fellow practitioner, there is this sense of familiarity, this sense of almost knowing each other, of meeting each other again. He compared this sense to the sense of meeting an old flame. This is the sense in the Lotus Sutra, that everyone is just meeting each other again, having played so many different roles over so many different periods of time. In this introductory chapter, we notice one theme that's occurring throughout this text. While something extraordinary, something that no one has ever seen before is happening or being shared, there's a sense of this having happened before or constantly occurring, a timeless revelation outside of space, outside of time. As we move through the text and we encounter the Lotus Sutra throughout this text, referring to itself, we might find ourselves asking, what exactly is the Lotus Sutra? The Lotus Sutra is the underlying truth of existence in its view, the underlying reality of each atom. It's also constantly available for us, constantly being taught. With this understanding then, within this framework of the view of the Lotus Sutra, what is not the Lotus Sutra? Every single moment of our life is the Lotus Sutra. The reality of the Lotus Sutra, the truth of the Lotus Sutra is available for us in each and every moment. So at the conclusion of this chapter, everyone, all categories of beings are gathered on Vulture Peak. The Buddha is emitting this radiance, illuminating what's happening at this moment in every other aspect of existence. And everyone's waiting for the Buddha to begin teaching. And we always have this view that the teaching is going to be offered by words. And while there's an aspect of this in the Lotus Sutra, there's also in the Lotus Sutra the demonstration of teaching, not only through words, but through manifesting. Like in this case, the radiance that is emitted by the Buddha. And we'll have examples, different examples of different scenes of the Lotus Sutra in which teachings are offered through some kind of experience. And this is a wonderful reminder for us. We have an idea that the Dharma is contained in Dharma talks like this one or other ones, or in books or other kinds of teachings like that. But as a teacher, we're always reminded that the role of a teacher is to bring forth an environment for the student to grow in. So a teaching is not only offered in words. In fact, the most important teaching of our life can be experiences. So here in the Lotus Sutra, while everyone's having this extraordinary experience of having the whole 3,000-fold world system illuminated, they're waiting for the Buddha to offer a teaching. So this is the sense at the conclusion of the introductory chapter, something extraordinary, some incredible teachings about to be offered. There's this juxtaposition of roles that has been occurring. The most advanced practitioners are asking questions of the younger practitioners and so on. So everyone's waiting for this teaching to begin. But at the same time, we already have this sense in the introductory chapter that everything is already accomplished. And this is a theme that we'll come back to again and again throughout the Lotus Sutra. This sense of everything being available right here and right now, outside of time, outside of space. So dear friends, as we can see, even in this short introductory chapter, the journey that we're going to undertake is going to be an extraordinary one, and I'm looking forward to it. I will be recording the full text of the introductory chapter and making that available for you, since not everyone will have the opportunity to have a copy of the text of the Lotus Sutra. So we'll make that available for everyone, and then we can spend some time listening to that and reflecting on it. And just also as we're going through our day, as we're practicing, having this sense, this broader sense of everything being available for us right here and right now. Good luck.